This morning we're talking about the emissions trading scheme and the impact on business in Australia. So we're looking at the lessons learned from the changes to the new legislation, and where they're talking about removal of the carbon tax, where we're really going from a brown Commodore to a red Commodore. So what we're looking at is our lessons learned from what we've done so far with the legislation, and also with the proposed changes that we have coming up after the election. So it'll be quite interesting to see what happens there. So we'll be looking at the risk management and our lessons learned from what's happening so far. Okay. One dangerous thing, I suppose, about the emissions trading scheme in Australia and the impact is that the accountants don't understand this, and some accountants are just going to allow a 10% contingency as a guesstimate without reviewing any of the impact of the company's operations. So the main critical area is supply chain management in this area, and we'll be looking at this issue to reduce the risk to business operations in the blue economy. There's a few examples out in the marketplace where people have gone down this track and actually saved money and reduced their bottom line. So a winery company, their liability was going to be $8 million underneath the carbon tax, and they reviewed their supply chain, and from reviewing the supply chain, and most of it got pushed down the supply chain, or trying to work out their liability. They went from $8 million down to $2 million. So, that's a drop of 75% into the supply chain, or reduced of that impact. So supply chain management is going to be quite a issue in the upcoming years, because of even from a risk side of things, for the risk of supply. So that's going to be a big issue. The top 500 companies in the world have identified this, and that's where they're taking action on this at the moment. So the next section, so the national and international policy landscape is always changing. Companies who don't take action or try not to reduce their risk are going to be at a higher, open to a high contingency of risk to their business operations in either supply and demand of moving the products around the world, or for having the impact on their business with their able to supply to their customers. For an example, a steel company that recently went into liquidation. One company only had one steel supplier, and they had all their contracts locked in at a low price, and when this steel supply went belly up, then they didn't have a backup plan. So this is where we need to work out from a risk side of things. Okay, righto, what's the risk of our supplier, or the impact of our supplier not be able to supply us, which is going to have a flow-on effect on our business operations. Okay, so 34% of the top global 500 companies have been deselecting their suppliers who haven't got a carbon plan in place, or a risk management strategy to make sure that they can supply to them. So that's quite interesting. Now, even with some of this legislation that may not affect people at the moment, then you never know when legislation changes on how that goes together. So what we can look at is, say, there's 800 companies that are going to be affected in Australia at the moment, only 300 underneath the carbon tax or the emissions trading scheme. And what you need to allow for, if they lower that limit, then is that going to put you in the firing line? So you need to reduce your risk as soon as possible. Okay, now we're looking at the second part of the emissions trading scheme, the impact of business in Australia. So earlier on we looked at the first part of the risk management. Now we'll dovetail back in a little bit more on how this sort of will go together. Okay, so what we need to look at now is the main question is how to carbon proof or minimise the risk to our business and the cost of compliance of our business. So as with our normal quality, safety and environmental risks that we have to our business, this puts another level on to our reducing our risk management or our the impact to our business that way. So from the emissions trading scheme, the way that it is managed, the emissions trading scheme will run by itself, and the recommendations will be put in by the Climate Change Authority. So the Climate Change Authority is more of the advisory body to the government for the reduction of emissions. So they're going to review the targets and see how close we go to our 2020 emissions target, which goes back to the commitment we made to the United Nations to reduce our limits. Now the thing out of that's supposed to, they're going to put out a report in February for their target for the reduction of emissions. So let's have a little bit of a look on what we need to do. So they're going to recommend the caps for the first 5 years and the trading of the carbon pricing mechanism. Now part of their part of what they're going to do is look at that, compare that to what we do for the United Nations. As part of our reduction strategy, we said we were supposed to reduce our emissions by 5% and 20% by 2020. So where we're looking at before, the report is due to be released by February 2015, so we'll have to be careful to keep an eye on that to see how that will go. We've got a pretty good idea on how that will work, but we'll see what happens from there. So underneath what we do with the United Nations Global Compact, we do an annual report to the United Nations. They review that to make sure that we're being a responsible business and carrying on with our business operations and trying to reduce the impact to our business. So if we're looking at what the Climate Change Authority will do, they'll look at what we're doing against the United Nations and then make recommendations for the lowering of the emissions threshold, which we'll look at in part 3. So let's look at the types of legislation that's going to be amended under the new ETS. So we've got the Climate Change Authority Act 2011, so that's where the Climate Change Authority came into play. The Energy Security Fund, so that's part of the funding for funding all the green projects to reduce our impact, so more of the clean energy. So that's underpinned by that Clean Energy Act. Now from the impact of these three from here, we'll see now it's going to affect the Fuel Tax Act, so there's going to be some changes to that, as well as the tariff. So this is where all the fuels and everything come in, which is going to be impacted on. And also from this part here is that'll go down onto the Clean Energy Bill 2012. And also when we're talking about the registry of units, so that's where the Australian units can be registered on the Australian register, and there's also an international register for the different types of credits, so BCS and stuff like that. Okay, and then the excise tariff of 1921, that's another one that's going to be affected, which will dovetail into all these other sections. So when they say we're just going to take a little bit out and we're going to change the carbon tax, and they're not going to do that, they're going to pull the carbon tax out of the legislation, that's fine, but then they're going to go run straight to the ETS. So that's where we're saying we're going to red Commodore What we're talking about is the emissions trading scheme and the impact on Australia. Now let's go and have a look at so this is part 3 of the series. So before we were looking at the Climate Change Authority, on what they need to do on the international guidelines and how they're going to set the target, which will come in February. The review of the legislation under the emissions trading scheme. So why do we end up doing this emissions trading scheme? So Australia is involved in the United Nations framework for climate change. Now this has been going for over 20 years, so this is part of our commitment in reducing our emissions 5% 2000 levels, and also by 20% by 2020. So by doing this, the only way we could do that was to put the carbon tax in initially to hit the for the top 800. There's 862 companies on the NGR, or the National Greenhouse NGERS, on the National Greenhouse scheme, or underneath the legislation. So out of that 862, let's call them sheep in the paddock, there was only going to be 330 companies affected by this. Now this, where this comes in, is under the 25,000 kilotons. Now what you'll probably find is when they do the review and they're looking at, okay, we've put in our ETS and we're only getting X amount of dollars from the ETS, from the 25,000 kiloton, the Climate Change Authority will put in a recommendation to reduce that from 25,000 to say 12,000 tonne, which will not only include the top 330 companies that are under the scheme now, it'll catch the other 500 companies plus another 1,000. So then that way, instead of the top 300 companies getting hit with in the sheep pen, I suppose, that's going to catch everyone else in the sheep pen, so that another 862 companies plus another 1,000. So that's one thing we'll need to keep an eye on. So then how do we do this to reduce our emissions, or how do we identify our impact? Okay, so the way this works out on what they call the NGRS system, which is based on the international guidelines of ISO 14064 and ISO 14040. So this is what they call the life cycle analysis of the impact of company operations, which is just to help streamline business efficiency. Okay, so there's scopes that are broken into 3 areas. Scope 1 is the direct result of activity of the business. Scope 2 is this is where your electricity and heating and cooling comes in. Now Scope 3, this is your supply chain, also all your suppliers going up and down your supply chain. So this is the biggest impact to people's businesses. So at the moment now, Scope 1 and 2 are under the emissions trading scheme. Now the global 500 companies are putting in Scope 1, 2 and 3 as part of their impact, as well as what we're doing to the United Nations. So we'll look at a graphical version of Scope 1, 2 and 3. So we're talking about Scope 1, so this is your direct impact of your company. Scope 2, so this is where your power and that comes in. Now Scope 3, you've got your purchasing, so this is going to affect your purchasing coming upstream from your supply chain, and also all your deliveries and everything going out that way. So that's going to affect the supply chain down the other way. And this is where all your franchises and investments in that, or end of life, or the product stewardship, will affect business operations. That's why we're talking about the TVs, tyres, all that sort of stuff, to reduce the waste going into landfill, so then we can put that back through the system and making the economy more sustainable. Emissions Trading Scheme, the impact on business in Australia, Part 4. So earlier on we've been looking at what's been covered by the legislation. We've gone through a little bit of the Emissions Trading Scheme and the Climate Change Authority. So we'll look at a few scenarios on what's going to happen a little bit in the future. Okay, so we'll just do a little bit of a review at the moment. So Climate Change Authority, they're being put together to recommend a national carbon budget and a emissions trajectory on the management of emissions in Australia. They'll review that against the United Nations guidelines, or reporting back to the United Nations on what we've done as being a responsible nation. The legislation changes under that have been proposed for the emissions trading scheme that are in place now. We've gone through a little bit of the carbon footprint, and we've explained the 3 scopes. So we're talking about direct activity with all company vehicles, your power and electricity. So this is where these two get affected underneath the carbon tax. The emissions trading scheme. But from being a responsible business, the Global 500 companies are including the upstream and downstream activities in their supply chain. Okay, so let's do the 5-point explanation, I suppose. So if we're going to move from the carbon tax scheme to an ETS, so really we're only going from a brown Commodore to a red Commodore. That's the easiest way of explaining it. So currently the limit's set at 25,000 kilotons. This impacts 330 companies that are currently paying $23 a tonne. So under the Angus legislation, there's 862 companies in the paddock. So then out of that 862 companies, that's where the 330 have been affected now. So that's where you can see that link. So what Australia did, we've linked our ETS to the environment to the European emissions trading scheme, and let's say at $10 per tonne. Now at the moment the carbon credits in Europe and that are increasing, so it will be interesting to see how that goes in the next 2 years. Now when we're talking about the Climate Commission, they're going to do a review in February to see what they need to do to reduce their limits. So let's run a scenario. So what if the Commission recommended a reduction to 12,000 kilotons? So don't forget we've got it at 25,000 now. So if they reckon to drop that to 12,000 kilotons, say the government says we're not making any money at the moment from this emissions trading scheme, or we haven't been reducing our emissions, the only way for them to reduce emissions from there is to capture more people in the paddock. So by reducing that from 25,000 to 12,000, instead of capturing the 330 companies, that's going to include the 862 companies plus another 1,000 companies underneath that. So this is the thing that we've got to watch, because this will have a higher impact on the local community and the business economy. So businesses that are prepared now will have a competitive advantage over other businesses in the field. So if we look at a responsible business, what's a responsible business? By being a responsible business, this is where the United Nations principles come into place to work out being responsible in the supply chain. So there's a standard called ISO 26000 which is used for this, and this is broken into four key areas: human rights, labour, environment and anti-corruption. So by following these principles from here, you can give you really good guidelines in managing your business. So we've got the 10 principles from here, so you can see that we've got breaking down of human rights, labour, environmental and anti-corruption. So we look at the Bangladesh.
We hope this short review was helpful. If you'd like to find out more, click the link below this video now.